Welcome all to today's lecture. Myself Assistant Professor Tukur Gupta from Ajay Kumar Garg Engineering College. The lecture series I am covering is for the subject VLSI Technology. Subject code is KEC 053. The target audience for this lecture series is semester 5th students of EC branch. Today the lecture I am covering is on the topic liquid phase epitaxy and epitaxial defects. So let us first understand what do we mean by epitaxy. Epitaxy refers to the process of depositing a monocrystalline film on a monocrystalline substrate. The deposited film is denoted as epitaxial film or epitaxial layer. So what is meant by this term epitaxy? Epitaxy is derived from the Greek words that is epi means above and taxi means deposition in ordered manner. So when some component is deposited in the ordered arrangement on something, like in this case there is a substrate on which the layer is deposited. Ordered arrangement of components of atoms is arranged on the substrate. That is why it is known as epitaxy. So epitaxial films may be grown from gaseous or liquid precursors. The substrate acts as the seed crystal layer and the deposited film takes on a lattice structure and orientation identical to that of the substrate. So this is the basics behind the epitaxial growth. There are different types of epitaxial growth process. One of the very interesting procedure is liquid phase epitaxy. This is known as the liquid phase because the component that is deposited as a monocrystalline layer is in the liquid form and it is directly deposited on the substrate. So let us understand this process. So it is a method to grow semiconductor layers from the melt, because this is in the liquid form, and this melt is deposited on solid substrate. So in this case the liquid material is deposited on the solid substrate. Liquid phase epitaxy, that is in short called LPE, is useful to grow multi-layered structures in which precise doping and composition control are required. So these are the two very important characteristics of this process, because this is the only process that is liquid phase epitaxy, because this process is a slow process. The growth is very slow in this process. So the doping level and the composition can be very precisely controlled. So these are the two characteristics of this process. The growth of the layer from the liquid phase can be controlled by a forced cooling of the melt. What is this? Like when the melt is deposited on the substrate, okay, so it has to be solidified to get converted into the monocrystalline form. So by forcefully cooling the melt according to the requirement, we can deposit the multiple layers and of the desired thickness. So the growth of the layer from the liquid phase can be controlled by the forced cooling of the melt. So according to the growth, according to the desired growth, according to the desired parameters, the melt, that is a solidification process, can be controlled in this liquid phase epitaxy. Impurities can be strongly reduced. So in this process, this is a very important point to note. This is one of the advantages of this epitaxial growth process, that impurities can be reduced in this process. Next point is doping can be achieved by the addition of dopants. So the doping is can be treated as a process of adding the dopants. So in this process the doping can be achieved by addition of dopants. So the level of doping, the desired dopants can be introduced into the substrate. So let us understand how this process takes place. So this is the basic diagram of the arrangement which is required for liquid phase epitaxy. In this case, we can see that there is a horizontal device here So in this case, a horizontal tool for liquid phase epitaxy, the melt or the melts are brought in contact with the substrate by a sliding board system. This is known as the sliding board system. This is the sliding mechanism using which we can push it back and forth. Now what is these things? These four are the wells which are containing the growth melts. So in these wells there is a growth melt, so which the liquid material that is to be deposited on the substrate. And now where is the substrate? So here is the substrate. This is one of the grooves which is containing the substrate. Depending upon the ability of the system, that how many substrates can be handled at a time, there can be multiple number of these grooves in which the substrate can be arranged, and accordingly the growth melts can be deposited on these substrates. How these are deposited? Using this pull rod, using this back and forth mechanism, moving mechanism. So this whole arrangement is known as the sliding board system, because there is a slider which can slide the arrangement, and this looks like a boat because there are the grooves, there are the wells containing the melts. Next, so how this process is taking place? When the dedicated process is finished, the next melt can be brought in contact with the next substrate. So this is the process of depositing the multiple layers, depositing the required monocrystalline layers on the desired substrate. So this way it is possible to grow multi-layer stacks in an easy way. Depending upon the setup of the system, one or several wafers, as I told you, there can be multiple grooves in this sliding board system. So depending upon the setup of the system, one or several wafers can be processed at the same time. The melt volume to substrate surface area ratio is small. What it wants to say is that the amount of the melt and the surface area which has to be on which the layer has to be deposited, the ratio is very small. So the melt volume needs to be refreshed again and again to attain the desired deposition rate. This is the actual figure of the sliding board system. We can see here is the push rod. This is the push rod. This is the heat exchanger. So heat exchanger, that is the arrangement of heating the whole system, and because the a proper ambience is required for the deposition. This is the graphite board. The board is made up of graphite. Now this groove we can see is the groove containing the solvent to be deposited. That is a silicon. That is a silicon germanium compound in the gallium solvent. This is the cooling gas inlet. This is the cooling gas outlet. So this whole arrangement is the actual image of the system. So here the bottom part of the board is fixed inside a quartz furnace, and thermocouple is attached to measure its temperature, because temperature is a very important parameter to attain the desired deposition rate. It also contains one or more grooves to hold the substrate wafers. Top part of the board is called the slider, which moves back and forth with the help of the push rod. It contains one or more wells to contain the growth melt. So there can be multiple grooves containing the substrate. There can be multiple wells containing the growth melts, so that the number of wafers can be handled at a time. Now the furnace tube is heated using the resistance winding. During the growth process, gallium arsenide substrate is loaded into the board, and slider well is filled with the melt of the polycrystalline gallium arsenide. As I told you, that this is the process of depositing a monocrystalline layer on the monocrystalline substrate. Substrate can be of same material or can be of different material. So in this case, let's take an example that gallium arsenide substrate is taken, and so it has to be, since the substrate has to be loaded into the board system, into the grooves. So it is loaded into the groove, and the slider well is filled with the melt of polycrystalline gallium arsenide. So the polycrystalline gallium arsenide melt is filled into the into the groove, into the wells, we can say. Then the temperature of the boat is lowered at a constant rate, and as the growth temperature is reached, the slider is pushed in to bring the growth material melt zone above the substrate. What it wants to say is that, okay, the melt is there, it has to be deposited on the substrate. So there should be some at a particular temperature, the deposition should take place so that the melt can be solidified perfectly. So this is the growth temperature. This is called the growth temperature at which the melt is to be solidified perfectly. Since the liquid melt is applied directly onto the substrate, therefore the method is called liquid phase epitaxy. So in this whole process, we can see that the liquid melt is carried into the wells. There is a substrate placed into the grooves. Since the material is deposited directly from the liquid phase onto the solid surface, that is why this process is known as the liquid phase epitaxy. And this board system is the whole arrangement using which this liquid phase epitaxy takes place. What are the advantages? Higher dopant concentrations and low defect occurrence. What are the uses? Growing gallium arsenide and other third, fifth group compounds. It's used for growing thin layers since the growth rate is small. So as we have already discussed, that this is a very beneficial point of this process, that thin layers can be deposited because the growth rate can be controlled. Next, let's discuss the epitaxial defects which can occur during the epitaxial growth. There are 5 major defects: line or edge dislocation as shown here. This is the defect. Second defect is stacking fault. This is shown by number 2. Number 3 presents impurity precipitate. Number 4 is growth hillock. Number 5 is buried layer defect. Let's discuss these defects one by one. In the case of line or edge dislocation, if the faulty line exists in the substrate, then the growing layer will also be having the same defect. Let's see this in this figure. Suppose there is the line defect in this substrate, and this is the growth layer. Okay, this is the epitaxial growth which is grown on the substrate. So this line defect is extended to this portion as well. This is known as a line or edge dislocation. Next is stacking fault. It is a planar defect that can occur in the crystalline materials. Error can occur in the sequence of these layers and are known as the stacking faults. So let's suppose there is some impurity on this surface, and as we grow the epitaxial layer above it, this is extended to this portion. So there is no growth, epitaxial growth in this portion. So this is the case of epitaxial stacking fault, nucleated by an impurity precipitate on the substrate. So this was the impurity precipitate on the substrate here at this point. So this has been extended to the up to the layer. Next is impurity precipitate. An impurity precipitate can be caused by the epitaxial process contamination, and this can create a defect. So this is the example. There is some epitaxial, there is some defect, that is, there is some precipitate inside the growth layer. Next is growth hillock. This is caused by the overgrowth of deposited epitaxial layer. Suppose there is not a proper control on the epitaxial growth and some extra layer has been deposited. So this is also a type of defect and is known as the growth hillock. Next defect is buried layer defect. This defect is basically due to the buried layer in the case where pre-epitaxial layer is grown in the substrate. So in this case, this is the pre-epitaxial layer. This is the pre-epitaxial layer. and there is some precipitate defect in this portion. So such layers are also a part of the process, fabrication process. These are known as the pre-epitaxial layers or undergrowth. And now suppose our epitaxial layer is grown above it, and this defect, precipitate, is causing a defect in this portion. Okay, so this, when we grow some epitaxial layer, this defect is extended to the epitaxial layer growth as well. So if any impurity is introduced in the pre-epitaxial or buried layer, then it creates a defect in all the overlying layers. So this has to be kept in mind, that there should not be any precipitate, any defect in the buried layer, otherwise it will also create the defect in all the overlying layers. So this is another example of this under layer defect. So there is a, we can see there is a precipitate in this layer as well, and it will cause extended defect in all the overlying layers. So these are the 5 major defects. That is a line defect. Let's sum up again. That this is the line defect. Any dislocation, any line defect in the existing substrate can be extended to the growth. Another one is the stacking fault. Like if there is some precipitate, there is some defect on the substrate surface, then it will be extended to the overlying layer as well. So this defect can be seen extended to the epitaxial growth layer as well. Next is impurity precipitate. So this is the example of the existence of any impurity in the epitaxial growth layer. And next is the growth hillock. If there is not a proper control on the growth rate, or if a proper ambience is not provided for the epitaxial growth process, then it can result in the overgrowth. So this is known as the growth hillock. And since in the fabrication processes, the planarity of the devices is very crucial, so any overgrowth is also a major defect in this case. Last one was the buried layer defect. So any defect existing in the buried layers will be extended to all the overlying layers, as can be seen in this figure. So these were all the 5 defects. So today in my lecture, I discussed a very important epitaxial growth process, that was the liquid phase epitaxy. For the liquid phase epitaxy, what we required is arrangement of the sliding boat device in a proper ambience. The sliding boat is of the graphite material, and the proper temperature is provided to the system, then only the epitaxial growth process takes place. This was a diagram of the sliding boat. This was the actual figure. Then we discussed the advantages and disadvantages of this process and the uses. The advantages were the high dopant concentration and the low defect occurrence. Uses were that this process is very beneficial in growing the thin layers, since the growth process can be controlled. And lastly, we discussed the epitaxial defects. So this was all about today's lecture. Thank you.